Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. In this month's Under the Lens video, I'd like to revisit a subject I first wrote about in my 2014 thesis paper entitled The Globalization Trap. I believe then, with the introduction of monetary policies such as ZIRP and quantitative easing, the U.S. and world had entered the early stages of a potential globalization trap. I believe 6 years later would be an appropriate time to see what has occurred in this context. Were we right? And where we might have been wrong. As such, I would like to cover those items listed here. I'll start with a spoiler alert. We were precisely right. Since our research was done, it has offered us an excellent roadmap of the pitfalls and signposts to watch for and beware of. A basic tenet of our research was, first, that the U.S. consumer would no longer deliver the consumption both the U.S. and global economies depended on and required. And two, policies of accelerated easy credit would dominate, eventually trapping the global economy in a liquidity trap of its own making. We also argued in 2014 that this would eventually lead to hyperinflation and a fiat currency failure. We were at the bottom of this ring at that time. We are now well advanced towards that expectation, which we have outlined in many of our recent videos, including our May Under the Lens video entitled Regime Change. U.S. consumption, as represented here by the PCE, or Personal Consumption Expenditure, took off in the 1960s as the U.S. surrendered sound money policies to finance the Vietnam War and the Johnson's Great Society through debt versus taxation. This was the first war that U.S. citizens were not asked to pay for with the likes of war bonds and taxation. Instead, it was effectively placed on a credit card, which ironically didn't even exist for the consumers back then. Then in 1980, the U.S. began paying its balance of payment deficit in credit versus the traditional settlement currency of the transfer of gold holdings. This ushered in falling interest rates that have unrelentingly endured since that time. Multiple generations have benefited from consumers seeing borrowing rates fall from approximately 19% treasury yields in 1980 to nearly zero today. This has made consumption financing increasingly possible for housing, cars, vacations, and all finance consumption items. This pushed consumption in the U.S. from the high 50% range of GDP to nearly 70%. This is an astounding level, which no other country in the world even comes close to. The global economy unfortunately became fully addicted to the U.S. consumer demand and increasingly built infrastructure and production to fill it. This accelerated further with the adoption of JIT, Kanban, and pull systems within the global supply chains. The global economy was locked in to the U.S. consumer demand. Any bump, and they immediately and significantly felt it. But how do you keep it going and growing further when interest rates approach zero, layoffs begin, shortened work weeks are adopted to avoid mandated medical benefits, and more companies leave the U.S. to manufacture offshore, taking with them the once high-paying jobs that supported consumption? The reality of the consumption dependency the U.S. and world rests on is actually masked by the fact that growth, as measured by an obsolete GDP measure, the denominator, is greatly overstated by factors such as government transfer payments and deficit spending. We spelled this out in our 2017 thesis paper entitled The Illusion of Growth. Additionally, considering that inflation metrics such as CPI are obscenely misleading through statistical games such as substitution, hedonics, imputation, and the basket of consumer goods chosen, it is little wonder it is very difficult to fully understand the degree of problem without a toiling forensic accounting effort. Let's spend a moment without the forensic accounting and just look at the government numbers as they report them to us, since it has now become impossible for them to hide. We're looking at four charts here. At the top is core U.S. retail growth. Below, from the left, is global GDP, corporate EBITDA, and U.S. capital formation. They all start in the 70s or earlier and go to just after the 2008 financial crisis. In 2008, we reached a point whereby the increasing rate of debt saturation could no longer be supported by global growth. Debt payments were unsustainable. Something had to be done, which then took the form of ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, and quantitative easing of various forms. You will notice the black A on the top diagram. We pick up from that point in time on this chart of the total U.S. retail trade industry on a percentage change basis year over year. We see a steady, consistent decline of growth. Remember, we're talking whether it's internet, store, or whatever, total U.S. retail industry. You will notice the chart ends in 2018. With the coronavirus, the numbers will drop through the floor. You will also notice that none of these monetary policies stopped or even remotely changed the trend. Here we show the Fed's PCE, or personal consumption expenditure measure, taking it back to its highs in terms of percentage change. Though the U.S. consumption growth rate has been steadily falling, it has come to dominate both the U.S. and global economies. Its slowing rate is squeezing the lifeblood out of the global economy as debt burdens go parabolic. We have fundamentally kept things together by shifting from capitalism, which is about savings being invested into productive assets, to an economic system of creditism where credit is used to sustain simply consumption. Globalization and its dependence on the U.S. consumer hit a wall leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. Global exports to output has steadily fallen ever since. Global trade volumes as a percentage of GDP reflect the same problem. We are being squeezed with insufficient wealth being created as collateral to fund the rate of debt increasing required to keep the global economy from expanding and possibly imploding from some sort of unexpected global shock. Is the coronavirus just such a shock? It is worth considering two definitions for us to build on going forward. First, what is wealth and how is it created? In its most simplistic form, wealth can only be created by growing it, mining it, and building it. It can't be printed by creating more money and liquidity. Yes, money and liquidity, if properly applied, can be used to create wealth, but that is not happening to the degree required. Money has went into financial engineering and financing stock buybacks and dividend payouts via increased debt. Developed economies now consume more than they produce, and therefore money and credit is being bled for consumption, which is not wealth. Emerging markets are only adding to the developed economy's ability to consume, which they built their financial and economic infrastructure on and is dependent on Western consumption. Their domestic consumption currently lacks the zest for the materialism Western economies promote and idealize. I believe at one time it was believed that the slack in the U.S. growth rate of consumption would be picked up by an increasing middle class globally. The middle class has developed, but nowhere near the adoption of consumption that is required. Secondly, what is a liquidity trap? Here are three widely accepted versions with slightly different descriptions. A liquidity trap occurs when expansionary monetary policies, that is, increase in money supply, does not stimulate economic growth. Or a liquidity trap occurs when people don't spend or invest even when interest rates are low. The central banks can't boost the economy because there is no demand. A liquidity trap is a situation described in Keynesian economics in which, after the rate of interest has fallen to a certain level, whether on its own or forced, as is the case today, liquidity preference may become virtually absolute in the sense that almost everyone prefers holding cash rather than holding a debt which yields so low a rate of interest. What do we get from these definitions? Well, a liquidity trap occurs when government policies, whether monetary or fiscal, does not stimulate economic growth or there is insufficient demand. You need to look no further than the velocity of money to see what is occurring. The velocity of money in the U.S. has been plummeting since just prior to the dot-com bubble implosion. Monetary policies of liquidity and low rates and fiscal policies of deficit spending have been inconsequential in resolving what ails the U.S. economy and now the global economy. Money and credit creation are no longer medicine, but rather now the poison in actual fact. Let's look further into what is now wrong globally, and the 5 steps that have occurred that have locked central banks into this liquidity trap of their own doing. Global growth stemming from U.S. consumer demand by a cheap interest rate financing and the uncontrolled expansion of eurodollars by global banks has led to a fragile global imbalance and global financial distortions. The core driver of global imbalances was labor rates, as approximately 2 billion workers entered the capitalist workforce when communism ended in failure. The massive rebalancing required the incumbent developed nations to see their standard of living fall to balance the increase in the emerging markets. There is simply insufficient global demand growth to offset the differential. Instead of a global strategy implemented and thought out to solve the problem, it has been relegated to the fittest and more powerful countries. All this occurred while the middle class in America has been gutted, and with it, the ability to sustain consumption. The primary issue running through the economy today is that most Americans lack a sufficient wage capable of boosting spending and getting the economy operating at a desirable pace. Real consumer spending is clinging to the critical 2% pace, where sub-2% pace is typically associated with recessions. The global engine of aggregate demand has been crippled because we have crippled the U.S. middle class without the rest of the world taking up the slack at a sufficient rate. It is much a cultural as economic issue in other countries than the developed world. It all starts with the world's insatiable pursuit of growth, shown at the top center of this diagram. Let's go around this destructive and predictive cycle. First, the pursuit of real growth. Every country and corporation is faced with the persistent challenge of increasing economic growth. There is never enough, and any reduction in the rate of growth causes economic and financial hardship. Even China, the poster child of growth, is now feeling the fallout and pressures of a slowing growth rate. We had global labor arbitrage. I think it is safe to say that the U.S. experienced a paradigm shift since the late 90s, as over 48,000 U.S. manufacturers left the country looking for cost advantage through global labor arbitrage. Overlay this with the advent of the internet and its incredible creative destruction of the nature of work and labor utilization, and you have a recipe for a shock which we don't yet fully understand or grasp. We have caused a goods and services per unit labor cost problem. I am certainly no communist, as I read Karl Marx in university, and as a young student actually worked both on a kibbutz and a moshav in Israel, where I came to completely reject socialism and communism. However, Karl Marx and Nikolai Kondratiev's research both point out different structural flaws in the capitalist system. They sounded academic at the time, but now appear, to me at least, to not be so academic after all. My co-host at Macroanalytics, Charles Hugh Smith, reminded me once that Marx expected capitalism to experience a series of ever larger boom-bust cycles that would eventually precipitate revolution and overthrow of the existing financial political order. His thesis was based on one of the drivers of these cycles was the interplay of increasing production and declining labor costs. Simplifying greatly, Marx recognized that industrial capital, as opposed to finance capital, could only increase profits and accumulate more capital by raising production and or establishing a price-fixing cartel or monopoly, or what I often call crony capitalism. Mechanization characterized industrial capitalism in the late 19th century, and Marx observed that as mechanization increased productivity, the marginal value of labor decreased on a per-unit basis. He was right. What happens to real disposable income then? The bottom line of this is that real disposable income eventually contracts. The middle-class engine of your society slowly and steadily gets gutted. Any of this yet sound familiar? The rate of aggregate demand growth slows. What happens is the rate, and let me stress the second derivative here, of aggregate demand growth falls. To stimulate growth, we then expand money and credit, since this is the accepted solution to cyclical adjustments. Forget for a moment the whole notion of the marginal propensity of that expansion to achieve anything. We then get a global liquidity trap. Again, consider the definition of a liquidity trap. A liquidity trap is a situation described in Keynesian economics in which injections of cash into the private banking system by a central bank fail to lower interest rates and hence fail to stimulate economic growth. A liquidity trap is caused when people hoard cash because they expect an adverse event such as deflation, insufficient aggregate demand, or war. Signature characteristics of liquidity trap are short-term interest rates that are near zero, yes, and fluctuations in the monetary base that fail to translate into fluctuations in general price levels, yes again. Central bankers understand one thing. To get more debt, which is the creation of money which can only come into existence through debt, at least in the United States system, you need more credit. To get more credit, you need more liquidity. When Ben Bernanke, a student, importantly, of the 1930s Great Depression, became head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, he was forced to shift from simply credit creation, but to further it through the wealth effect. He targeted asset inflation through his enrich thy neighbor doctrine of global bank coordination. The realities of all this is there are limits. You not only get caught in a liquidity trap, but this system blatantly begins mispricing risk, loses pricing discovery, and creates malinvestment, thereby crippling the capitalist system from its inherent powers of rewarding winners and penalizing losers. Remember, that is why we have so many zombie corporations. In a functioning capitalist system, you get more for less. In a socialist system, you get less for more. That is exactly what is happening as the state takes on more and more control in an entitlement society. Excesses of anything lead to distortions, unintended consequences, and moral hazard. Excess liquidity eventually leads to collateral contagion and impairment for both borrowers and lenders. It all leads to increasing rates of deflation which central bankers can't halt without massive monetization, which inevitably leads to hyperinflation through fiat currency failures. I drew this stylized projection in 2014, where I felt the top would be an M-top, where the inside drop was deflation followed by a final lift, which would be a form of Minsky melt-up via hyperinflation. I think it is still the model, though who knows what the government will resort to. What we do know is what the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises warned us of. There is no means of avoiding the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The alternative is only whether the crisis comes sooner as a result of voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency involved. COVID-19 is not the cause of any of our problems, but it may be the event that accelerates the progression of the death cycle we appear to be on. The global demand and supply shock to the global economy and global supply chain is yet to be fully understood. It is highly likely to be worse and longer than most project, yet fully appreciate or understand yet. No doubt it is going to be crippling to total aggregate demand. We are likely going to experience a protracted W recovery or possibly a serious and L-shaped Greater Depression stage. Time will tell, but overlaid onto everything we discussed previously, it certainly doesn't appear optimistic. But it gets worse, if you can imagine. Here's why. De-dollarization, as we outlined in our 2019 thesis paper. 2. A potential coming Cold War and escalating global conflicts, as we outlined in this year's thesis paper. 3. Yet another EU banking crisis, which we fully expect to soon emerge as tourism, which supports Europe, fails to return in a timely fashion, and the EU policy approaches to address the COVID-19 impact fail spectacularly. And 4. Unprecedented social unrest as social sentiment turns negative. However, having said this, you need to be optimistic. Overdue systemic and structural change is going to happen. I have tremendous confidence personally in the human species' ability to both survive and continue to prosper. Change is difficult. There will be winners and a lot of losers, but out of the other side, it is highly likely we'll see another golden era. Be ready for the chaos, opportunities, and exciting future which lay ahead. On a personal note, my grandfather made his fortune during the Great Depression. When everyone was selling due to the banks foreclosing on loans and unwilling to extend credit, my grandfather always seemed to have soggy, damp $100 bills to buy what he felt was value when everyone else was broke. He was prepared when others were not. Make sure you have real spendable wealth when the inevitable opportunities present themselves. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will print the money, to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time, as I just said, for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2020 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. Thank you very much for listening.